So we're continuing in Luke this week. We're almost at the end. Luke chapter 22. And again, quite a long reading. We're reading 39 to 71. And he came out and proceeded, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples also followed him. And when he arrived at the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not enter into temptation." And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and he knelt down and began to pray, saying, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." Now an angel from heaven appeared to him, strengthening him. And being in agony, he was praying very fervently, and his sweat became like drops of blood falling down upon the ground. When he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping from sorrow, and said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray, that you may not enter into temptation." And while he was still speaking, behold, a crowd came, and one called Judas, one of the 12, was preceding them, and he approached Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" And when those who were around him saw what was going to happen, they said, "Lord, shall we strike with the sword?" And one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. But Jesus answered and said, "Stop, no more of this." And he touched his ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests and officers of the temple and elders who had come against him, "Have you come out with swords and clubs as you would against a robber? Whilst I was with you daily in the temple, you did not lay hands on me, but this hour and the power of darkness are yours." Having arrested him, they led him away and brought him to the house of the high priest. But Peter, was following at a distance. And after they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter was sitting amongst them. And a servant girl, seeing him as he sat in the firelight and looking intently at him, said, "This man was with him too." But he denied it, saying, "Woman, I do not know him." Little later, another saw him and said, "You're one of them too." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." And after about an hour had passed, another man began to insist, saying, "Certainly this man was with him, for he's a Galilean too." But Peter said, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." And immediately while he was speaking, a rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had told him before, "A rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. Now the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him and beating him, and they blindfolded him and were asking him, saying, "Prophesy, who is the one who hit you?" And they were saying many other things against him, blaspheming. When it was day, the council of elders of the people assembled, both the chief priests and scribes, and they led him away to their council chamber, saying, "If you are the Christ, tell us." But he said to them, "If I tell you, you will not believe, and if I ask a question, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God." And they all said, "Are you the Son of God then?" And he said to them, "Yes, I am." Then they said, "What further need do we have of testimony? For we have heard it ourselves from his own mouth." This week there are 3 stages or 3 settings for the narrative. The first one is in a garden. The second one is at the house of the high priest. And the third one is in the council chamber of the Sanhedrin. So we'll consider each of those locations in turn. And we begin in the garden. Gardens have a really important function in Scripture. In Genesis, the world began in a garden, the Garden of Eden. And Revelation ends in a garden, where we see the tree of life bearing fruit, every kind of fruit, and where the leaves of the tree are for healing of the nations in Revelation 22. So it starts and finishes with a garden. And right here, at the turning point of time itself, the most important moment in history, we find ourselves in a garden, the Garden of Gethsemane. And we begin by seeing the agony of Jesus in this moment. He's with his disciples, and yet he's completely on his own. He's asked them to pray for themselves, that they will endure what they're about to see, what will happen, and he's withdrawn to pray on his own. And the conflict within him as he thinks about what he's about to endure and go through the agony of the cross has caused him to suffer. What he will suffer in this way has caused him in his humanness to really be in a place of struggling and as he thinks about the awfulness of the cross. Hebrews 12:2 says, "For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." Well, in this moment, there's no joy, just horror about what he's about to endure. The joy will come when the work is finished and he's rescued humanity from guilt, sin, and shame and restored them in their relationship with the Father. But at this moment, there is no joy. Instead, we see agony on his face as he sweats blood. And under conditions of extreme stress, people have been known to do the same, to sweat blood. And so it gives us an indication of just what he's suffering in this moment, in his soul, in his spirit, as he contemplates what's ahead. I can't imagine what he was going through in his mind at that moment. And yet God did not leave him completely alone. In response to his prayers, God sent an angel to strengthen him so that he could endure and do the will of the Father. Many people have experienced the comfort of angels in time of crisis, and you and I may even have done so without knowing so. God watches over each one of us and will give us that which we need in the moment as we look to him. Returning to where the disciples are, he finds them sleeping and he rouses them from their sleep and tells them they need to be praying so that they can get through the next 72 hours. And I can well imagine that after a hearty meal with some wine earlier in the evening that we know they spent celebrating the Passover, prayer was the last thing on their minds and sleep was probably the first thing in their minds. Who finds it easy to stay awake after a heavy meal? How many people here on a Sunday afternoon go to and have a little nap? You don't have to confess. Not surprising, and since it was past midnight, that these disciples were sleeping. According to Matthew's Gospel, this is the second time Jesus has returned to them and found them asleep. But his encouragement for them to stay awake is interrupted by a large crowd suddenly arriving with clubs and swords and with Judas at the front. And the arrest begins with a betrayer's kiss. How awful and insincere must that kiss have been? That which should have represented brotherhood and love was a sign to spark conflict and anger. And even though it was night time, it was the moment when real darkness began, a darkness that intensified until the moment of Jesus' crucifixion in the middle of the next day, when the whole world became dark. This was the time of darkness, before the light could break through. And at this moment of crisis, the disciples are still thinking in terms of an earthly kingdom. And so they take up the fight against the mob. And all four Gospels tell us that one of them struck the high priest's servant and cut off his ear. But it was only John's Gospel that tells us it was Peter who did that, once more being over-enthusiastic. Only Luke's Gospel tells us that immediately Jesus healed the servant of the high priest. Imagine that. In that moment of trial and arrest, he reached out and he touched the servant's ear and healed him. And according to John's Gospel, the name of that servant was Malchus. I have a suspicion that he may have been in the early church because he's named such. Jesus stops the fighting, and at this moment the disciples scatter to the four winds, according to Mark's account. And so that's stage one, the garden. Stage two, the house of the high priest. And the action then moves to this house of the high priest. And John tells us that Caiaphas was the current high priest, but that this action took place in the house of Annas, Caiaphas' father-in-law, who had been high priest before. But what's unique to Luke's gospel is that we don't go inside the house. We stay outside in the courtyard. Luke doesn't record for us what went on inside. He only records what was happening outside with Peter. And Peter is running scared. He wants to know what's going to happen to Jesus. According to John's Gospel, John was also there. But we only see Peter in Luke's Gospel, who has followed the arresting crowd to this location. And he's warming himself by the fire as he watches and listens to what's going on inside the house. And as he's sitting by the fire, he's challenged 3 times concerning his identity. "This man was with him too," said the servant girl. "You're one of them too," challenged another man. And finally, an hour later, someone else in the small group pipes up, Certainly this man was with him. He's a Galilean." And at this, Peter is exposed. His accent has given him away. Everyone knows he's a northerner. And it's at that moment Jesus turns around and makes eye contact with Peter. And Peter is suddenly completely devastated. He realizes that what Jesus said about him, betraying Jesus, has just come to pass. And it says he went out very sorrowful, in grief. Imagine that look from the Saviour in that moment. Instead of fear in his heart, there is rampant guilt and a sense of abject failure. Have you ever felt that sense of guilt and failure? Either you've let someone down or you've done something you know is wrong, and then in the moment you've regretted it. And in this moment, Peter felt that same experience in spades. He'd followed Jesus for 3 years. He'd come to know that Jesus was the Messiah. And he'd even said just a few hours before that he would die with Jesus. But now all of that was in tatters. He'd let the Lord down. He'd let himself down. But how much compassion, but also hurt, must have been communicated by Jesus towards Peter in that moment. Just to take a peek ahead for a moment to Easter Sunday. When the women came to the tomb to anoint Jesus on the 3rd day, according to Mark 16:7, the angel said to the women, "Go and tell the disciples and Peter. Make sure Peter knows." Jesus wants to make sure that Peter gets the message and that he's still included. And despite his failure, and then of course in John 21, we have the threefold restoration of Peter to match his threefold denial. He was devastated, but Jesus didn't give up on him. And the message here, as I said last week, is that failure is not final. No matter what we've done or not done, there is always a way back to God. God's grace and his willingness to forgive and restore is far greater than our ability to fail. I'll say that again, if I can find it. God's grace and his willingness to forgive and restore is far greater than our ability to fail. Humanity from the beginning has failed. At the fall, God could have rolled up the universe like a scroll and started again. Instead, he chose to launch his rescue plan, beginning with Abraham and culminating in Jesus. And all of this flows out of his great love for each one of us. The only ones he doesn't rescue are those who choose to reject his rescue plan, his love, and choose to live their own way. And each one of us can trust in the rescuing and restoring love of God, which is poured out for us through Jesus. And so if you feel you failed or are carrying the burden of that guilt, bring your failure to God. Confess it to him. Receive again the restoring love and power of God. And just as he restored Peter and set him back on the path to fulfill his destiny, so he will restore us, you and I, when we come to him. And so we move to the 3rd location, stage 3. And it's just at this point that the action changes. The transition begins as the men holding Jesus, the temple soldiers, begin to beat him and mock him as a false prophet. And this is at the moment when his prophecy concerning Peter's denial has just come true. What irony. He's prophesied that Peter would deny him, and yet these men are saying he's a false prophet. And the use of the word blasphemy in verse 65 is interesting. They're blaspheming Jesus' identity as the Son of God in their insults, but also blaspheming God himself in their abuse. Whatever the reasons that Jesus was taken to the high priest's home first, the action moves to the council chamber, the debating hall for the leaders of Israel. And the protagonists are those who have been monitoring Jesus' behavior and challenging his authority for the last 3 years. And they've had every opportunity to identify correctly who he is, and yet they've willfully chosen not to recognize him as the Messiah. And so their first question concerns his identity. If you are the Messiah, tell us so. And these are resonances here of Satan's word during the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. If you are the Son of God. And it comes close to Peter's declaration. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus has told them in every way possible who he is. His words, his actions, through healings and miracles, through his teaching, through seeking to restore the temple to its proper use, all of this tells them who Jesus was. And this is why Jesus says to them, even if he does tell them in words, they won't believe him. And it's at this point we see Jesus embracing his destiny. He's no longer in the turmoil of the garden. He's not struggling to do the Father's will. The battle has been resolved. Rather, he's now taking control of the situation and giving them the evidence that they cannot discern for themselves. And he says, but from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of God. And in doing that, he's quoting 2 Old Testament scriptures. Psalm 110:1, which reads, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet, which is the most frequently used Old Testament reference in the New Testament. And then he also quotes Daniel 7:13-24, which reads, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. And he approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. And he was given authority, glory, sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. And so by referencing these 2 scriptures, which are clearly about the Messiah coming, Jesus leaves his audience in no doubt as to who he is. And yet still they ask, are you the Son of God then? And Jesus replies, yes, I am. And it's this question, are you the Son of God then? Concerning who Jesus is, that every person on this planet needs to answer. People who suggest that Jesus never existed are historically ignorant. The existence of Jesus is not a historical thing that's up for debate. Jesus existed. There's no doubt about it. All we have to answer is, who do we believe he is? Do we believe he is who he said he is? Do we believe that he did the things that are recorded about him? If he's not, then we could ignore him as a false Messiah, false prophet, which is exactly what the leaders of Israel do in this moment. But if we believe he is who he says he is, then our only option is to bow the knee and worship him, surrender our lives to him, and trust in him for our salvation. There is no other tenable option. Either he is who he says he is, and he's the saviour of the world, or he's a false Messiah. There's no other option. And so Jesus gives the leaders all the evidence they need. The trial's at an end, and he stands condemned for simply affirming who he is. Next week we'll consider the 3 trials of Jesus before Pilate, before Herod, and then again before Pilate. Then on Good Friday we'll consider the events of the crucifixion itself before rejoicing in the resurrection on Easter Sunday. God bless. Alex, come and lead us. Thank you.